Tired of Microsoft's shit? Can't run Windows 11? Don't want to run Windows 11? For a myriad of reasons? Want to learn Linux, but you don't know where to start? Well, you've come to the right place. This will be a small dual boot and survival guide for Linux newbies. This guide will cover preparing your machine for installation, the installation itself, and some essential post-install steps. This guide will also discuss some of the major differences between Linux and Windows, mostly to prepare you for using Linux, and to aid with looking for help. This guide is meant to be combined with other sources of information, especially when it comes to installation. When choosing a distro, make sure you look at your chosen distro's installation guide and resources. With that disclaimer done, first off, system requirements. I'll just use the requirements of the distro I'm going to shamelessly plug, which I'll put on screen now. Yeah, do you think your computer can handle that? You need a pretty beefy machine to handle that. Oh man, 2 gigabytes of memory? Holy fuck! That's impossible! Yeah, enough fucking around. You can probably run this just fine. In fact, you can probably run this on your phone. Did you know that the Android kernel is actually based off of the Linux kernel? You might actually be running Linux on your phone. Next, pricing. For the most part, Linux is free, so you have nothing to lose but time, which you probably don't value anyway, considering how you're watching a long-ass video about Linux. The real requirements for using Linux are a semi-functional brain, patience, and a dash of jank tolerance. Now, you might have heard some stuff about how Linux basically requires you to learn how the terminal works, and while it doesn't help to understand the basics, which we'll go over in a bit, you only really need to use it once or twice outside of advanced use cases, or tinkering with technical bullshit. Really, just keep in mind that Linux is somewhat different from Windows and that not all of your old tricks will work, but most will, and general knowledge will still mostly apply, albeit slightly different. In fact, over the course of this video, you may come to the conclusion that Windows was designed by crack addicts. With all that being said, let's move on to just use Mint, which is what I'll be using in this video. Okay, no, there's more to talk about here, though not that much. At their core, most distros are identical. Most belong to one of 3 families: Debian, Red Hat, and Arch, though there are other, less popular families. Each of these families has their own package manager. Package managers are how these systems handle installing programs, also known as packages. What's important about these package managers is what packages these package managers can access. Debian and Red Hat are stable, which means they have crispy old packages. The main difference between the two is that Red Hat is for enterprise use cases. Arch is a rolling release distro, which means it is always up to date and quite unstable if you don't know what you're doing. Now, Mint is based off of Ubuntu, which is based off of Debian. Or if you install Debian Edition, Debian. Ubuntu adds its own packages on top of Debian, and Mint itself adds even more. Now, I'm recommending Mint because it's purpose-built for newbies, and it's not made by Canonical. Anyway, let's move on to Right, so first off, you can skip this entire part if you don't intend on keeping Windows around. Just put away anything you don't want to lose on another drive and format that shit. Though as of the time of writing, there are a few things Linux is incapable of running, mostly just things with invasive DRM or anti-cheat. If you cannot or are unwilling to stop using these awful products, you might want to keep your Windows installation and just reboot into it when needed. The first thing you'll want to do is make the installation media. Just download the .iso file from the download page, preferably using the provided torrent link. Next, we'll need to burn the .iso on something that you can plug into your computer. Usually a thumb drive, but it could also be an SD card or any sort of optical media, too. To do this, we'll need either Etcher or Ventoy. I personally recommend Ventoy, as you can put a Windows.iso on there as well, in case Windows decides to kill itself. Next, we'll want somewhere to install Linux too, usually a hard drive or SSD, but you can put it on any sort of bootable block device. Now, if you want to install Linux on a different drive than Windows, open the partition manager and just wipe out the partitions on said drive. Easy. Now, if you want to install Linux on the same drive as Windows, you'll need to shrink your main Windows partition. Here's where you might want to grab something alcoholic. First, you open the partition manager, which, by the way, hasn't received a UI update in 10 years.
Then you ignore 3 of the 4 partitions that Windows has created when it should, realistically, only require 2. Then you right-click the main partition and select Shrink. Then it asks you how much you want to shrink. You gotta think very hard on this, because there's no faster way to kill a Linux installation than depriving it of disk space. Then you may be told that you just can't shrink said partition. Why? Because of the page file. That's why. See, when a computer gets close to running out of RAM, it writes some of the less used contents of memory to the page file, which, in any other OS than Windows, is usually pre-allocated, and is usually periodically cleaned up. In any other OS than Windows. Microsoft likes to pretend that the page file doesn't exist, and shoves it in there deep. So you'll have to follow me exactly, at least on Windows 10. I have no experience with Windows 11, because I can't install Windows 11, because I haven't been a good enough pay pig for hardware manufacturers recently. Rant aside, you'll need to turn off the page file, then restart, shrink the partition, and immediately turn on the page file again, because you do not want to run out of memory while that thing is still disabled. Now, we're still not done. Windows does a few other things that no OS does that cause major issues. Thankfully, we can fix these, but we're going to have to open up a command prompt and screw around with another administration tool. Fuck me till I'm dead. First thing to address is fast boot. Now, if you're unaware, fast boot is something that Windows does to make booting faster. How it works is that it hibernates instead of shutting down. Hibernation essentially writes the operating system's state to the disk, which is fine as it's supposed to be used when, say, you close a laptop, or when you explicitly tell it to, or during other similar events. Not as a replacement for shutting down. In fact, there's a likelihood that you have had some sort of issue where restarting the machine didn't work. But shutting it down and rebooting it normally fixed everything, and that's because Windows doesn't use fast boot when you cold boot. But wait, it gets worse. When you install Linux, you can still mount and read and write your Windows partition. I don't recommend doing this too much, and Windows file structure is a goddamn mess, but it is useful and won't cause damage to your Windows installation. Unless Windows is hibernating. Then you either won't be able to, or Windows will decide to commit suicide if you try to. This is probably not desirable, so let's disable it. Except you always want it to be off, and Windows loves to reset random options like this back to default. So, what do? Why, you try to turn it off every time Windows boots, of course. To do this, we need to first make a batch file. To do this, we make a text file, paste this command in there, and then close it. Then, if you haven't already, enable file extensions here. Now, change the .txt to .bat. Finally, put this file in some permanent location and keep it there forever. Now, to make Windows run this batch file every time it boots, you open the event scheduler and add a new event, and tell Windows to run said batch file on every boot. Good God, that sucked. One last thing we need to change before we're able to safely install Linux. Fun fact. Almost every operating system uses UTC at the hardware level. Then it modifies for time zone. Almost every operating system. Windows likes to set the hardware clock to local time. There is no reason to do this. Whatever, there's a fairly easy way to permanently set this. Problem is, it uses the registry. I could go on a tirade about how the registry sucks because it's barely human readable, but that would make this video run for even longer. Anyway, to fix this, we need to open up the command prompt. Make sure you open it as admin. Next, paste this command in there, and we're done. Fucking hell. Alright, on to... This will be nice and quick. First off, hit restart while holding shift. This will take you a special menu in which we will need to do something very important. Click Troubleshoot, Advanced, UEFI Firmware Settings. This will bring you to your computer's UEFI menu. Here we'll want to do a few tasks. First thing you'll want to do is temporarily turn off Secure Boot. Secure Boot is designed to prevent someone from screwing with your bootloader without your permission, which is actually great and useful, but causes snags when installing a new OS. Thus, we need to turn this off while installing. Next, we need to make sure that your UEFI will try to boot from your Magic USB first, before trying to boot from your hard drive. Finally, if you're using NVIDIA, unplug any monitors using a connector that isn't HDMI or DisplayPort. You'll need to install the graphics driver after installation. Right, so now, if you hadn't already, plug in your funny USB, then reboot. If you did everything right, you should be greeted with a black menu labeled Grub. Just hit enter. Now you should be seeing a desktop. Congratulations, this is Linux Mint. Now, before you hit that funny install icon, just make sure everything is working correctly. If it's all good, hit the funny install button. Hit install alongside Windows, and make sure to install the codecs. Now you wait. Feel free to use the browser to entertain yourself, or you can use it to troubleshoot if anything goes wrong. Once it's done, reboot and unplug the USB when prompted. Once your PC finishes restarting, you should see that same menu from earlier. Do yourself a favor and read. Select Linux and we can get into... Now, when Mint finishes starting up, you should be greeted by a welcoming menu. Just go through it, changing things as needed. Make sure to check for drivers. After you're done, we have to address something. You remember the page file? Well, Linux has its own equivalent called the swap file. Well, the etymology is funny. The main concern is that Mint only comes with a 2 GB swap file. This can cause issues, but it is very fixable. Though, sadly, as of the time of writing, it's only fixable with the terminal. Open that shit and I'll tell you how to fix it. This will be the only time you'll need to touch the terminal, though I heavily recommend learning it because it is extremely useful. Here's how to learn how to terminal. Type in man. Man is the manual command. It will tell you how to use any command you give it. In this case, we've opened up the manual for the manual. If you see a command you want to know more about, just type in man and the name of the command. Now to fix the swap file. First, type in sudo swapoff /swap file. This will disable the swap file. Oh, right. Sudo is how you execute commands as admin. You don't need to open an admin terminal, ever. Next, type in sudo rm /swap file. rm is the delete command. In this case, it will delete the swap file. Next, sudo flocate-l with your desired size, g, /swap file. This command will create a file called swap file, which will be the size specified. I recommend allocating a swap file at least the same size as your memory. Next, sudo chmod 600 swap file. The funny thing about sudo is that it's actually telling the admin or system account to do things. Chmod is how you change permissions, with 600 allowing only the owner to read and write. Because we used sudo to create the swap file, this means that only admin and system permissions can read or write to the swap file. This isn't required for swap, but is good security practice. Next, sudo mkswap /swap file. This will mark the swap file as, well, a swap file. You can actually name your swap file whatever you want, but it's often best to call it what it is. Finally, sudo swapon /swap file. If you can't figure out what's happening here, you may, in fact, have brain damage. And that's it! We're done with the terminal. Before you close it, type in neofetch for a cute ASCII version of the Mint logo. Now, to install some of the essentials. Open up the Mint menu and click on the Software Manager right below Firefox. This is where you can very quickly and very easily install most applications. Now I'm going to assume you'll want to do some gaming. If so, well, you're in luck! Steam is right here, so just install it and we'll get back to it later. Next, if you're a degenerate like me, you'll want Discord. Well, it's also right here, though it's in a slightly scuffed format called a Flatpak. Flatpaks are, for the most part, great! Though they are a little jank at times, and if a non-Flatpak version is available, grab that instead. Oh, right. Flatpaks are, for the most part, very similar to Android apps. They even come from an app store, which is entirely different from the package repo. Though, like Android apps, they are sandboxed, which does cause all sorts of weirdness and issues, especially because most developers don't bother with using Flatpak systems for asking for permissions. This means you often need an external program called Flatseal to fix a few borked permissions.
Anyway, the Discord client on Windows is already pretty cursed, so the lesser used cousin of the Windows client is even more fucked up. Especially because Discord is busy cramming in more useless garbage instead of fixing things such as the mobile or Linux port. Though, if you're a 12th Prestige Discord degen, you probably use a custom client anyway. Oh, and speaking of downloading shit, open up software sources and get off the main servers, onto the much faster local servers. Alright, enough anguish. Back to Steam. Log into your Steam account, go to Settings, Compatibility, and turn on Steam Play. Congratulations! For the most part, you have now solved most compatibility issues with most games. Though, some games have anti-cheat configured to insta-ban Linux users. These games are terrible, and you should take this as an opportunity to stop playing them. But if you don't care to do that, you can still play them by swapping over to Windows when you want to play them. Just install those games to a separate partition accessible by both Windows and Linux, and they'll always be up to date. Can't say the same about Windows, though. Oh, and speaking of updates, the funny shield on the taskbar, called a panel in Linux, will have an orange dot beside it when an update is ready for you. Mint will never automatically force updates on you unless you tell it to, and you won't need to restart for most updates. Back to compatibility. Outside of intentionally broken shit, most things will be compatible. Just check proton.db to check game compatibility. Proton.db is also excellent for troubleshooting and general performance increases. Outside of Steam, compatibility just needs a little extra work, which is where Wine comes in. Wine is not only something I crave every waking moment, but it is also a very nice utility to have around. Though I'd recommend against installing it directly from the software manager. You should instead go to WineHQ and follow their instructions, or, better yet, install something like Lutris, Bottles, or Heroic. See, Wine on its own is a little unwieldy and can be managed much better by an application. Also, out of the box, Wine has several missing parts that they cannot legally redistribute. These launchers can take out some of the guesswork that comes from that. Anyway, I'd like to wrap this video up within the year, so here's a few places where you can get some more info. Linux is a wonderful, if occasionally painful experience, but it can be made much less painful with knowledge. Also, I use Arch, by the way.